Welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing headaches. Okay, so I just want to take a moment to discuss where we currently are in this video and where we're going in this video, because we're at the moment discussing quite a bit of background knowledge for understanding the pathophysiology of tension-type headaches, and indeed it will be helpful for understanding the pathophysiology of all the other types of headaches that we're going to go on to. But you might feel as though we're kind of getting lost, we're losing track of where we were actually hoping to go. So I'm just going to spell out the structure of this background portion of the video that we're going for at the moment. So we have just studied or revised the anatomy of the trigeminal nerve. We've seen the three branches of the trigeminal nerve, the ophthalmic nerve, the maxillary nerve, and the mandibular nerve, and we've seen which territories of the head they actually innervate. Where are we going now? Now what I want to see is where the central processes of the pseudo-unipolar neurons of the primary sensory afferents that come in the trigeminal nerve are going to go. And they're going to go into something called the sensory trigeminal nucleus. We'll also see the motor trigeminal nucleus, which is where the multipolar motor neurons that go out in the trigeminal nerve will have their cell bodies. And these structures are going to be mainly in the brainstem, although as we'll see, the trigeminal sensory nucleus extends down into the first two levels of the cervical spinal cord. So, I want to study this trigeminal nucleus. After we've studied that, I want to study the pathway by which the information is going to go up to the primary somatosensory cortex. So we'll see the second order neurons, which form the trigeminothalamic tract, and then we'll have a look at the nucleus in the thalamus, the ventroposteromedial nucleus of the thalamus, that then houses the third order neuron, which will carry the information up to the primary somatosensory cortex. After we've done that, then we've done the pathway for the trigeminal nerve, we will then move on to do the cervical spinal nerves, because remember, the trigeminal nerve is the way that the sensory afferents coming from the facial region of the head come into the central nervous system. However, sensory afferents from the back of the head and the neck region, they're going to come in through the cervical spinal nerves, so we'll go over those, and we'll go over the spinothalamic tract, and we'll mention the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway, and we'll see which thalamic nuclei they go to. So overall, what this background will tell us is exactly how nociceptive information from the head and neck region is actually getting up to the brain. After we've done that, we'll return back to discussing the pathophysiology of tension-type headaches, so we'll try and explain how the different triggers can then lead to the activation of the nociceptors in the frontalis muscles, the temporalis muscles, and the occipitalis muscles. And even though you may think, what an excessive amount of background just for explaining the pathophysiology of tension-type headaches, we will use this for all the other types of headaches as well. So because we're discussing them all at once, I think it is justified to go into this background that is relevant for all of them. If I was just making a video on tension-type headaches, I probably wouldn't bother going into quite this much background. But because we're covering all the different types of headaches together, I think we can justify getting a really solid background in the anatomy. So, that's the motivation for what we're currently doing, just in case you're losing faith. So, we now need to see then where the nucleus, the trigeminal sensory nucleus, that the central processes of these pseudo-unipolar neurons are going to go into. So for this, we need to mainly, we need to mainly study the brainstem, but also the first two levels of the cervical spinal cord. So, let me firstly write this down. So the trigeminal sensory nucleus is going to be part of the trigeminal cervical complex that we are aiming to try and understand. However, it's not the only component of the trigeminal cervical complex. The substantia gelatinosa of the first three cervical levels is also a component of the trigeminal cervical complex, but we'll see that much later on. And it will all make sense how it's effectively a continuum of each other later on. So it will make sense. But we do need to go over quite a bit of background first. So, at present then, we are trying to study the trigeminal sensory nucleus. So I'll just write this down here. So we want to study the trigeminal sensory nucleus. And this is a very big nucleus. It's not a nice little blob of a nucleus that we can put in a little portion of the brain. It's a great big long stretched out nucleus that spans all the height of the brainstem. It goes right through the medulla, through the pons, up into the midbrain, all three levels of the brainstem, and it also goes down into the first two levels of the cervical spinal cord. So, the first thing that I want to do is draw out the brainstem again, but this time I want to do it properly, because really I drew a sort of very basic picture here. So I want to draw two pictures of the brainstem, one from the front and then another from the back, because we are going to go into the anatomy of the brainstem in quite a bit of detail. After I've drawn those pictures, I'll mark on the sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. I'll also put on the motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, and then to really get a good understanding, I'm going to take cross sections through each one of the different components of the brainstem and also the cervical spinal cord, and show you precisely where the trigeminal sensory nucleus is in all of those levels. So, that's our work for the time being. So, we are studying the trigeminal sensory nucleus. So, let's begin then by drawing the brainstem as you would see it from the front. So, we will do this in this position here. So I'll start by drawing the medulla, and as I say, I'm going to put a bit more effort into this picture than I did previously when drawing this. So this is going to be the medulla here, like so. Full name, of course, as I said earlier, the medulla oblongata. So that's the top of the medulla, and this is the bottom of the medulla. And I've already managed to make one of those horrible splodges down here, so let me just get rid of that. And then let's put the pons on top of the medulla. So up here, we're going to have the pons in red sitting on top of the medulla. And here's the top of the pons. And then we'll have the next bit of the brainstem, which we didn't draw on our previous picture, which is the midbrain sitting on top of the pons. Now remember, the midbrain has a funny shape because it has the cerebral peduncles at the front. And remember, when you look at the medulla in, the midbrain in cross section, it looks like the head of Mickey Mouse. Although when I draw it, it always ends up looking more like a pig than Mickey Mouse. But when you see it on an MRI scan, it really does look like Mickey Mouse. Of course, from this angle, it's not going to look like Mickey Mouse. We're just going to see the cerebral peduncles with the gap in between them. So let me show this. So here's one of the cerebral peduncles. Of course, this is the right cerebral peduncle. And then we've got the gap here, like so. And then there's the corner of the gap back there. And then you've got another cerebral peduncle in this position. And then I'll draw the midbrain going back. And then, of course, you've got the superior colliculi then at the back there. So that's kind of what the midbrain looks like from the front. So this is a new portion of the brainstem that we haven't drawn previously, so I'll write down its name. So this is the midbrain. So these three parts, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla together, they are the three components of the brainstem. Below the brainstem, below the medulla, you then have the spinal cord below, which I'll just draw in here in yellow. So these can represent the first two parts, and there's another damn splot. These can represent the first two parts of the spinal cord. So this can represent C1 and C2, which are the two levels through which the trigeminal sensory nucleus is going to actually be present. Now, I'd just like to add a few details onto the front of the medulla, because the medulla doesn't actually look like this. It's a bit more detailed. It's got a few lumps and bumps on its front, whereas the pons is smooth, just like this. So let me put some of these lumps and bumps onto the pons. I'm trying to get that colour back. I think it's this colour, but I apologise if I'm now drawing these in a different colour, and I think I am. Never mind. So, the things that I'm going to add on here are the pyramidal tracts, which, remember, are the corticospinal tracts that run right down the front of the medulla on both sides. So here they are. These are the two pyramids of the medulla, or more properly, the pyramidal tracts. So I'll put this here. These are the pyramidal tracts, also called the corticospinal tracts. Oops. Undo the bit where I was trying to turn that into a T. Pyramidal tracts, or the other name, corticospinal tracts. So from the cortex to the spine, and I should probably write it out in full. So CST is for corticospinal corticospinal tract. Now, remember what the corticospinal tract is. This is the major motor control of the entire body for voluntary movements in particular. So when you decide to make a movement, you activate certain neurons up in the primary motor cortex that then sends their axons right down from the primary motor cortex, which you know is right up in the cerebral hemispheres. We'll see that later on when we draw pictures of the cerebral hemispheres. It sends its axon right down through the brainstem, through the cerebral peduncle here, through the pons, into this pyramidal tract, and then it will decussate at the bottom, cross over to the other side, because remember, the contralateral cerebral hemisphere controls a side of the body. So the left side of the body is controlled by the right cerebral hemisphere, and the right side of the body is controlled by the left cerebral hemisphere. So these are the pathways that go down to tell alpha motor neurons what to do. These are the major motor pathways. And when we take cross sections at every single level, we will be able to see the corticospinal tract all the way down. But they're very visible on the front of the medulla. You can see them as these sort of, I don't know how to describe it, Swiss roll-like projections outwards on the surface of the medulla, and these are the pyramidal tracts or the corticospinal tracts. The other bumps that you see on the anterior surface of the medulla are the inferior olives, and I'll try and get the colour, actually now, I'll go for another colour, Will, spice it up. So these are on the front of the medulla, and they're in the superior part of the medulla, not in the inferior portion. So there are these bumps on the anterior surface of the medulla, which are the inferior olives. So they are another landmark on the anterior surface of the medulla, and again we will see these when we take cross sections through the medulla. So we have one on both sides, the inferior olives. And you can also call them the inferior olivary nuclei, but we'll just refer to those as the inferior olives. So that's the picture from the front. Before I show you the trigeminal sensory nucleus on this picture, I now want to draw the equivalent picture from the back, and this picture is more likely to go wrong as compared to this one. So we'd like to try and keep that one in view whilst we draw the other one, and let's try and do it in the same colours. So we're now looking from the back. So starting with the midbrain looks even more boring from the back. You just see the colliculi from the back. So let me draw this here. So here is the back surface of the midbrain, and you're now going to see all four colliculi, which are these hemisphere projections outwards towards the back. So you have two superior colliculi, here they are. This is the left superior colliculus, this is the right superior colliculus, and you have two inferior colliculi, the left inferior colliculus and the right inferior colliculus. So I suppose I should write their names down. So these are these projections backwards. I'll just write the superior's names. So these are the superior colliculi. If you wanted to turn it into singular, you take off the I and put us, collicula, so left superior colliculus, right superior colliculus. Okay, so that's not particularly interesting. It's more interesting to look at the pons from the back, because now we're going to see the superior cerebellar peduncles and the middle cerebellar peduncles, and in fact also the tops of the inferior cerebellar peduncles, which are the ways in which the pons and indeed the brainstem connects to the cerebellum behind. Remember, behind the brainstem in the posterior cranial fossa, the bottom portion of the posterior cranial fossa, is the cerebellum, and that has to be connected to the rest of the brain in some way, and the way that it's connected is through these cerebellar peduncles that connect to the brainstem. So when the cerebral hemispheres want to send messages to the cerebellum, they have to go via these connections from the brainstem to the cerebellum. There is no direct connection between the cerebral hemispheres and the cerebellum, as we'll see later when we study the meninges, which is a bit of background knowledge you can look forward to when we're discussing the pathophysiology of migraine. There is the tentorium cerebelli in between the bottom of the cerebral hemispheres and the cerebellar hemispheres, the top of the cerebellar hemispheres. So there's no connection through there. The connection is through the brainstem. So let's try and put this on. So we'll start by putting on the superior cerebellar peduncles. So we're imagining that we're drawing them as though they've been cut through, which is what you're seeing here. So these are the cut surfaces of the superior cerebellar peduncles, and they then connect to the cerebellum behind. Then let's put in the middle cerebellar peduncles. These are the biggest ones. So here is one middle cerebellar peduncle, here's another middle cerebellar peduncle, and then you'll have the beginnings of the inferior cerebellar peduncles. But the inferior cerebellar peduncles are really part of the top of the medulla, so this is actually the end of the pons here, and then you'll have the medulla below. So let me just put some names on here. So I'll put on the names of the superior cerebellar peduncles, and then I'll assume that you can understand the names of the other ones. So superior cerebellar peduncles. And of course you have two of them. You have, whoops, I've managed to make another little dot over there. You have a left one and a right one. So those are the superior cerebellar peduncles. These are the middle cerebellar peduncles coming out of the back of the pons, and these are the tops of the inferior cerebellar peduncles. Now here's the back of the pons here, but then there's a space, a great big cavity here, which has as its walls, its front wall is the back of the pons here, its lateral walls are these cerebellar peduncles, its back wall is the beginning of the cerebellum, and that great big cavity, hopefully you'll know the name of this is the fourth ventricle. So I'll try and squeeze this in. So this structure, this cavity, which will be cerebrospinal fluid filled, is the fourth ventricle, and it's continuous with the cerebral aqueduct above that goes through the midbrain. So up here there will be an opening into the cerebral aqueduct that goes through the midbrain and then will connect up to the third ventricle above, and it's also continuous with the central canal that goes through the medulla and then the spinal cord below. And so let me now show the medulla. So we need our sort of grey for this. So here is the inferior cerebellar peduncle coming down here on both sides, like so. And it's split into two there. So that's the continuation of the inferior cerebellar peduncles. Here's the left inferior cerebellar peduncle, here's the right inferior cerebellar peduncle. And then let's put the rest of the medulla on here, like so. Okay, now, if you look at the back of the medulla, you can also see lumps and bumps. You can see below the inferior cerebellar peduncles, you can see, again, two sausage roll-like shapes, or Swiss roll-like shape projections from the back of the medulla. So let me put these on here. So I'll put a division down the middle, like so, and then we're going to have another division there, and another division here. So I hope that's clear that this is one of those projections backwards. Here's another projection backwards, here's another projection backwards, and here's another projection backwards. So overall, if you were walking over this, you'd go over one hill, then you go over another hill, then you go over another hill, and then you go over another hill. So four little hills here that extend all the way down the back of the medulla, and these are actually where the dorsal column nuclei are. So this is the nucleus gracilis, and this is the nucleus cuneatus. So I also just sort of mark on here, that's the top of the medulla back there, which makes up a bit of the bottom of the front wall of the fourth ventricle there. So remember, this is the fourth ventricle, and then it will be continuous right at the bottom here with the central canal that then goes down the rest of the medulla and then goes through the spinal cord below. Okay, so these are some pictures of the brainstem from the front and from the back. What I now want to add on to my picture of the brainstem from the front is the trigeminal sensory nucleus. Then, to truly show you this nucleus, I want to take cross-sections through the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, and we'll take a very clever cross-section of the medulla. We'll go for this sort of level, right through the middle, so that what we will get is we'll get the inferior olives, and we'll also get all of the dorsal column nuclei, so we will be below the inferior cerebellar peduncles here, so that we get all of the dorsal column nuclei there, because once you go above the inferior cerebellar peduncles, the dorsal column nuclei have ended by that point. So, let's firstly mark on then the trigeminal sensory nucleus. So as I say, this is a massive great nucleus. So let me find some colour to have this in. Let's do it in vivid purple so it clearly stands out. So, as I say, it's a big nucleus. It's not like a nice round sphere. It's instead a great big stretched out sausage that spans through the entire brainstem. So, of course, the big lump of it is in the pons. So I'll start by putting that one on here. Whoops, I need the pen, not the movement. So, here we go. I'm drawing the right one first, but I might add on the left one. And then it has a little stick bit going up into the midbrain above, and then it has a stick bit. Whoops, let me try and connect it up better. Okay, it has a stick bit going down into the medulla below, and then going even down into the spinal cord below, like so, into the C1 and C2 levels, just like I've shown there. Okay, I think I'll only draw it on one side. Actually no, I'll be brave. I just felt it went so well on that side. Now I don't want to ruin the picture by doing it on the other side, but I will be brave so that we've got a picture of it on both sides. So again, here is the plump bit in the middle of the pons here, and these different parts of it all have different names. We'll go over that in a moment. Then a thin bit stretches up into the midbrain, like so, and although, whoops, let me undo that. Even though I've drawn it and it looks as though it's going up into the cerebral peduncle, it doesn't. It goes up into a posterior portion of the midbrain. I'll try and show it here. It goes up, and when we look at it in the cross section, it's going to look as though it's over here rather than here. So it should be in this position. We'll see it when we put it in cross section. In fact, I might try and correct that a little bit. Let me just get the black pen to rub bits out. So firstly, let's rub this bit out so that I can correct that. And also let's rub the top of that out. So making corrections here, it goes up and we'll see it in cross section right back there. So it is not at the front here. So I might just make that obvious by putting that bit back there. And now let's correct this bit up. Oh dear, that's worse. Bear with me for a moment whilst I faff around with my drawing. I don't know if this is going to work because they're so far away from one another. That will have to do. Okay, that is a little bit too thick. Imagine that that's thinner. I don't want to faff around too long trying to make that look perfect. Okay, and then the same on the other side. As on the other side, it goes right down through the lateral portion of the medulla, right down into the lateral portion of the spinal cord, like so, and then it comes back up on this side, like this. Okay, the one on the right-hand side is better than on the left-hand side here, but I hope that gets across the point. We have these two trigeminal sensory nuclei. What's a nucleus? Remember, it's a collection of cell bodies, so this structure is just a collection of cell bodies that is going to contain second-order neurons that the primary nociceptive afferents of the trigeminal nerve, not just the nociceptive afferents, I apologise, the primary sensory afferents of the trigeminal nerve are going to send their central processes into this trigeminal sensory nucleus, and they're going to synapse on these second-order neurons. These second-order neurons are then going to send their axons into something called the trigeminothalamic tract, and those will ascend up to the thalamus, and then they'll synapse on the third-order neuron. Okay, the other thing that I'd like to show you at this point is the motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, which sits just medially to this middle bit of the trigeminal sensory nucleus. So it's much smaller. That bit in green there, that is the motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. So motor nucleus, and I'll just put of 5. So remember, that is where the cell bodies of the motor neurons that will send their axons into the trigeminal nerve are present. Okay, and you've got one on both sides, and they're just medially of that plump bit of the trigeminal sensory nucleus, or the sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, if you prefer the fancier term. So, because the trigeminal sensory nucleus is so large, we split it into 3 parts. The plump bit at the middle, at the centre of the pons here, that bit there, that is called the principal sensory nucleus of 5, or just the principal nucleus of 5. So this is the principal sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, because that's the massive plump bit, so it makes sense for it to be called the principal sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, because this is where most of the central processes of the primary sensory afferents are going to synapse. So principal sensory nucleus of 5. So, what are the other two portions called? This bit that's extending up into the midbrain, that's called the mesencephalic sensory nucleus of 5. So I'll just write the first bit because the rest of it's the same. So this bit extending up into the midbrain is called the mesencephalic. So encephalic means pertaining to the brain. Mesencephalic means pertaining to the midbrain. So that's why that's called the mesencephalic portion, because it's extending up into the midbrain. So that's the mesencephalic portion. Next portion, the bit that's extending down into the spinal cord, this is known as the spinal sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. And I'm just faffing around getting rid of the ugly spots. So this is spinal sensory nucleus of 5. Now, because the spinal sensory nucleus of 5 is so long, what will happen is when all of the central processes come into the pons from the trigeminal nucleus, from the trigeminal nerve. Remember, the trigeminal nerves are in these positions, and it might be a good idea for me to actually put the trigeminal nerves on here. So the trigeminal nerves are coming off the front of the pons here. So when the central processes come in, the most obvious one for them to go into is the principal sensory nucleus of 5. However, some do go up into the mesencephalic one, and some do go down into the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. Now, the number going up into the mesencephalic one is very small. However, the number coming down into the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve is much larger. So what you actually do see is a little column of white matter lateral to the grey matter of the cell bodies of the second order neurons that are in the actual nucleus, that is called the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve. So we have two things to take in here. There is the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, and there is also the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve. And what that is a little white matter tract that runs lateral to the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, and that's just all the axons of the central processes of the primary sensory afferents that are coming into these lower portions of the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. So they have to get there somehow, and that is the white matter column that they're following. So they go through the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve to get into lower portions of the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. And when we take cross sections, you will see both the spinal nucleus and also the spinal tract sitting lateral to it. When we take cross sections of the medulla anyway, you'll see both of them. Higher up, you won't see that. You might ask, well, why don't you see it when you're looking at the mesencephalic nucleus? It's because very few actually go to the mesencephalic nucleus, so you don't get a significant enough cluster of processes to actually be called a tract. Okay, so let's now begin doing this in more detail. I want to show you exactly where these nuclei actually are in the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. Now you might say, well, isn't this picture good enough? I get I understand it from this picture, but we are going to see a lot of other nuclei in the brainstem region, and I'd like you to understand where those different nuclei are positioned relative to this. And if we just give you this picture, it doesn't quite get that across. So what I'm now going to do is draw 3 cross sections of the brainstem and then a cross section of the cervical spinal cord to actually show you precisely where these nuclei actually are, these different parts of the trigeminal sensory nucleus are in the different sections. And we'll see other famous landmarks of the different parts of the brainstem as well. So, where do I want to begin? I think I will begin, it would be logical to start at the top and work down, but I think I will actually begin with the pons. And the reason for that is that the principal sensory nucleus of 5 is massive, and I feel like we should show that first. So what I'm going to imagine doing is taking a cross-section through of the pons right through this centerpiece here, so that I will get the principal sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve and also the motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve in my cross-section, and I can show you this. And also, thinking of it from the back, what will we get? We're chopping through here, so we will see the inferior cerebellar peduncles at the back. going into the cerebellum, and they're delivering information into the cerebellum. And that's important to know about because it will justify some of the other structures that we're going to see in the cerebellum. So I think I will make a little bit of, well, I'll bring this up a bit, and we'll draw the pons here. So the pons has a very sort of convex front. It has a very sort of smooth convex front. So this is the bit that I'm going to start off drawing. So here we go, like so. And it should ideally be symmetric on both sides. I haven't quite achieved that, but it's good enough. So this is the front of the pons, and then we're going to now draw the back of the pons. And at the back of the pons, of course, what we're going to see is the inferior cerebellar peduncles. So here's one inferior cerebellar peduncle, and then there's the other inferior cerebellar peduncle. And we're imagining we've cut those, so I'm not particularly interested in those structures. It's not brilliantly symmetric, but I hope you get the picture. Those are the inferior cerebellar peduncles going backwards. Okay, so what shall we start by putting on? Well, I think the landmark, probably the best landmark to split up the pons into two separate bits is the medial lemnisci, which is the two medial lemniscuses on both sides. So remember, the medial lemniscus is a very, very important white matter ascending tract. It is carrying a huge amount of sensory information from lower portions of the body up. It carries fine touch information, vibration sensation, and also proprioceptive information. All of the central processes of primary sensory afferents of those three modalities, fine touch, vibration, and what was the final one I said? Proprioception. They go up in the dorsal column of the spinal cord, and then they synapse in the dorsal column nuclei, they'll then have the second order neuron in the dorsal column nuclei, and that crosses the midline and goes into the contralateral medial lemniscus. So the medial lemniscus is a major part of the ascending pathway, taking sensory information from the rest of the body lower down up to the brain, and we will need to know about it later on when we're talking about sensory information from the neck region and from the back of the head coming in through cervical spinal nerves, because they're going to send information up to the brain through the spinothalamic tract and the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway. But for now, it's just going to be a landmark structure in our cross-section of the pons here. So firstly, let me just actually label up that what we have here is the pons, and now let me put on the medial lemniscus on both sides. So here is the one on the right hand side. We're imagining we're looking down from above, so that's the right hand side, and here is the one on the left hand side. So those structures there are the medial lemnisci. Now I do not think that medial lemnisci is actually a word. Lemnisci, it's the natural thing to have as the plural of lemniscus. However, I don't think it actually is a word. I'm going to use it nevertheless because I think it sounds better to lemniscus is, which I think is even less of a word. But when I'm actually writing it down, I'll just have to put the singular. So the singular is lemniscus. So you have the left medial lemniscus and the right medial lemniscus, which in plural I will refer to as medial lemnisci, although I don't think that's actually a word. The plural, I don't believe there is actually a word for the plural, which is really annoying. If someone does know that, please do put that in the comments. I would be delighted to hear it. So those are the medial lemnisci, very important landmarks because they nicely split the pons into two parts. The front of the pons here, which is where there are going to be lots of crossing fibres that are part of the cortico-pontocerebellar pathway. So let me explain this in a little bit more detail. So remember, these structures at the front of the midbrain, the cerebral peduncles, they contain the descending tracts. They contain loads of axons, and this is why it probably would have been useful to do the midbrain before we did the pons. But never mind. So right at the front of the midbrain, you have the cerebral peduncles, and they have loads of axons coming down. That's what they consist of. A great chunk of white matter, loads of axons coming down from the cortex of the cerebral hemisphere, and they're going down for two different things. That some of them will be going down to the spinal cord to command neurons down in the spinal cord to do things in the body. Others are coming down to command the cerebellum to do things. So we've talked about the corticospinal tract. The corticospinal tract will be coming through the cerebral peduncles, and the corticospinal tract will also go through the pons before it then goes through the front of the medulla. And indeed, the corticospinal tracts will be in these positions. So I think probably the next thing to put in is probably the corticospinal tract. So I'll do that. So in white, that's one, and here is the other. So those are representing the corticospinal tracts, the CSTs, and I'm just going to move this up a little bit because my handwriting's bad when it's right at the bottom. So, you have the two corticospinal tracts moving through the front portion of the pons. What else do you have in this front portion of the pons? Well, you have loads of fibres crossing over, and these are the fibres, these are part of this pathway called the cortico-pontocerebellar pathway. And I'm not going to tell you much about this, but just a brief explanation. So, we're talking about the cortico-pontocerebellar pathway, and I think it is actually all one word, but I'm not going to try and squeeze it in as all one word. So cortico-pontocerebellar, and then a bit more space, pathway. So this is a connection between the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum. The cerebellum, the bit behind the brainstem, it is very, very important in the motor system, and the thing that it does, the best answer if you want to give a one-line answer for what the cerebellum does, is it's very important in calibrating movements. So let me give you a motivating example. If you want to catch a ball, that needs to be an extremely precise movement. It needs to be extremely well calibrated to the visual information that your cerebral hemispheres know all about. Visual information goes to the cerebral hemispheres. When we want to make the movement of catching a ball, that movement needs to be extremely well calibrated to that visual information. We need to use the visual information, and we need to work out exactly what movement we need to make so that we can actually catch the ball. Otherwise, we will fail to catch the ball. We can make a lunge, we can make, a ball out of our hands, but if it's not well calibrated, we will miss the ball. The cerebellum is extremely important for doing that sort of calibration, for altering what the cerebral hemispheres have come up with as a motor plan for doing this movement and making it so that it will actually work. So when you want to catch a ball, the cerebral hemispheres come up with a nice motor plan. They say, if we contract all of these muscles by this amount at these times, this is the movement we want to make. They then send that information, the motor plan that they've created to the cerebellum, along with the visual information that the occipital portion of the brain knows all about, and the cerebellum says, no, you'll miss the ball. You need to alter your motor plan like this, and it sends it back up to the cerebral hemispheres, and the cerebral hemispheres then say, yes, we'll initiate this, and it goes down to the spinal cord, and it's actually initiated. So the cerebellum is extremely important in calibrating movements that need to be calibrated. So, this means that the cerebral cortex, the cerebral hemispheres, need to be communicating with the cerebellum, and this is what the cortico-pontocerebellar pathway is. So not all of the descending axons in the cerebral peduncles here, and I think I'll actually write that term down because we haven't done it so far. So, those projections on the front of the midbrain that contain all of these white matter fibres, they are the cerebral peduncles that I keep referring to. Okay, so not all of the fibres in the cerebral peduncles are going to be corticospinal tract fibres. A good fraction of them will be corticospinal tract fibres, i.e. they're fibres going from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord. However, another good fraction of them will be part of this cortico-pontocerebellar pathway, the communication between the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum. And this is the pathway taking information from the cerebral cortex to the cerebellum, not information back from the cerebellum to the cerebral cortex. So, fibres from the cerebral cortex come down in the cerebral peduncles, they come into the pons here, this portion of the pons, they're by the corticospinal tract in the rest of this, and then you might think, well, are they just now going to go into the into the middle cerebellar peduncle, and then they're in the cerebellum? The answer is no, it's more complicated than that. They synapse onto another neuron that then carries the information into the cerebellum, and these neurons are in little nuclei called the pontine nuclei, and there are loads of these in this front portion of the cerebellum. Too many for me to sort of try to put them on here, but in this front portion of the cerebellum there are going to be pontine nuclei, so little collections of cell bodies. So this is the frontal portion of the pons here. In this, and I think I was accidentally saying the cerebellum, this is of course the pons. In the frontal portion of the pons, there are going to be pontine nuclei in this frontal region around the corticospinal tracts, and this is where fibres coming down from the cerebral cortex will go. They will synapse on another neuron in a pontine nucleus. That fibre will cross over, so there are loads of crisscrossing fibres, and I might just put a bit of this on. So I'll put some sort of lines on here, which is what you actually do kind of see if you actually see one of these cross-sections histologically. You can see this sort of crisscross. There are distinguishable lines going across like this, and these are fibres from the neurons that have their cell bodies in the pontine nuclei that are crossing over, and then they'll go into the contralateral middle cerebellar peduncle and then into the cerebellum. Now, why has there been this crossover? Remember, I've already reminded you that with regards to the cerebral hemispheres, the left cerebral hemisphere controls the right side of the body, the right cerebral hemisphere controls the left side of the body. It's not the same for the cerebellum. The left side of the cerebellum controls the left side of the body, the right side of the cerebellum controls the right side of the body. Therefore, it is a partnership between the left cerebral hemisphere and the right cerebellum that controls the right half of the body, and it's a partnership between the right cerebral hemisphere and the left cerebellum that controls the left side of the body. So they do have to cross over when you're having fibres coming down from the cerebral cortex. So let me paint a picture of this. Let's say we're talking about the right cerebral cortex, so on this side, which will of course be controlling the left side of the body. It will send a fibre through the right cerebral peduncle down into the right side of the front of the pons here. It will then synapse onto another neuron in a pontine nucleus on the right side of the front of the pons, and that neuron will cross over to go into the left middle cerebellar peduncle and into the left side of the cerebellum, which again controls the left side of the body. So the right cerebral hemisphere works with the left cerebral hemisphere, cerebellar hemisphere rather, and the left cerebral hemisphere works with the right cerebellar hemisphere. So I hope that's clear now. So that's what this frontal region of the pons contains. It contains the corticospinal tracts that are just going straight through it, and then it contains the pontine nuclei, and those are the crisscrossing fibres of the neurons that have their cell bodies within the pontine nuclei that are part of this cortico-pontocerebellar pathway, the pathway by which the cerebral cortex communicates with the cerebellum. Okay, we do not need to understand anything more about the cortico-pontocerebellar pathway for understanding headaches. I'm just giving you a bit of the background neuroanatomy here. Okay, so more things to put onto our picture then here. So I think it's probably about time that we actually put on our principal nucleus of the our principal sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, and also the motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. So let's do that now. So we need our vivid purple back again, and we'll bring this picture up. So of course, the principal sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve is quite lateral in the pons, and indeed it's in this sort it's in this sort of position here, and again on this side, so just behind the medial lemnisci, like so. Now putting in the motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. The motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve is a tiny little nucleus compared to the principal sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, and it's just medial to the sensory nucleus, the principal sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. More things that at this stage I think I should tell you about the cross-section of the pons. We've done obviously the main things now. We've done the middle cerebellar peduncles. What I think I should tell you about is what's in all of this space here. So this is the middle cerebellar peduncle. But what about all of this space behind where we have the principal sensory nucleus of the trigeminal and the motor nucleus of the trigeminal? What's in this space? This is a portion that we call the reticular formation. This is the bit that is in the pons, so we call it the pontine reticular formation. So the reticular formation is a structure that goes throughout the brainstem, and it contains loads of centers that control loads of very important things about the body. So for instance, the one example that we'll see that is, actually no, we'll see more examples of things that are contained within the reticular formation. It contains a whole bunch of things, but one of the things that we'll see later on is that the vomiting center, the center in the brain that controls when you're going to vomit and when you're going to feel sick, this is in the reticular formation. Now, the structures in the reticular formation are generally not distinct nuclei. They're not, the control center isn't a bunch of neurons that are all close together in a nice anatomical blob like we have seen for the principal sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve and the motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. We love it as medical students and as neuroanatomists and as whatever when there are beautiful little nuclei within the brain, loads of neurons all clustered together that are all performing some role. We love that. However, loads of things in the brain are not that simple. It doesn't need to be that simple. You can have a center that's controlling something where the neurons that are part of that are all far away from one another and they're connected by long-going axons. And the reticular formation controls lots of centers like that, where the neurons that are part of the center are not actually that close together. They're separated out like a spider's web, and amongst them are loads of other spiders' webs controlling different things, parts of different centers. And that's what the reticular formation is, and it goes throughout the brainstem. So we'll have midbrain or mesencephalic reticular formation, and we'll have medullary reticular formation as well. But this region, and I'll try and find a appropriate colour to do it in, I'll do it in a sort of grey, a mysterious grey colour. All of this sort of region here in grey, that is all reticular formation, and we don't talk about there being two reticular formations. We don't talk about a left reticular formation and a right reticular formation. We see it as, because it crosses the midline here, we see it as all one, being part of one, and it's connected above and below to the mesencephalic reticular formation and the medullary reticular formation. So it's one sort of strip at the back of the entire brainstem, effectively, that is called the reticular formation. So there's effectively a strip at the back of the brainstem called the reticular formation, and we are seeing the pontine section of that here. So let me write its name down, so we'll squeeze it in here, I think. So this is the pontine reticular formation, and reticular means like a spider's web, and we can understand why that is because the centers that are, and I'm about to put foramen, whoops, I'm getting tired, reticular formation, and we can understand why that is because the centers, as I say, that are controlling something, such as vomiting, the vomiting center that we'll see later on, because I want to explain to you why you feel sick and maybe even vomit when you get a headache. These centers are not anatomically distinct sites. They're more like spiders' webs in amongst other centers that are also like spiders' webs. So it contains loads of different, very important centers, the reticular formation. And we are seeing the pontine reticular formation. From now on, when I draw the reticular formation on other cross-sections, I will just refer to it as the RF, rather than having to write out reticular formation every time. Okay, so for now, I think that's all I want to show you on my cross-section of the pons. Later on, we'll add other things onto this. Later on, we'll add on locus coeruleus and the spinothalamic tract and the trigeminothalamic tract. But for now, these are the major structures of the pontine cross-section, and of course the two structures that I aimed to show you here. Okay, so I'm contemplating whether I want to take a break or whether I'm going to courageously go on and do another one first. I think we'll courageously go on and do another one. We're only doing the midbrain, that's not too difficult. So we will do another section and then we'll have a break. So we're going to now take a section through the midbrain so that I can show you the mesencephalic section of the sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. So we'll do it over here. Now, when I was doing the pons, I did it this way with the front down and the back up. I will try and do that again when I do the midbrain. So let's now do it. So we'll start by drawing the back of the midbrain then. So we'll have the superior clavicular, and I should say what level of the midbrain we're going through. So back up to the pictures here, we're going to take a cross-section through the top portion of the midbrain, and there's a nice word that I can use for top. People like to say rostral, which means towards the nose. Caudal means towards the tail. Of course, we don't have a tail, but imagine where we would have a tail if we were a monkey. So we're going to take a cross-section for a very rostral portion of the midbrain, so we are going to see the superior colliculi rather than the inferior colliculi. Okay, so let's do this. So here, trying now to continue it on neatly, here are the superior colliculi, and then let's continue it. No, it's already gone off at the wrong angle. I need it to go smoother. This is better. Here is the, I'm trying to work out which one it is, right cerebral peduncle. Here's the gap in between, and I apologise if this isn't quite symmetrical, but ideally it would be. And there is the left cerebral peduncle. It's not bad, it could be a lot worse. Okay, so let's go over some of the landmark structures on here, and then of course we'll go over the structure that I specifically want to show you, which is the mesencephalic portion of the sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. However, that is not really a landmark structure of the midbrain. It's a tiny little structure that if we were just doing a course on neuroanatomy we would not go over, but of course it's important for us. That's the reason we're doing all of this, so I will show it on this picture. So, to begin with, let's put the things that I've told you about already on, which are the cerebral peduncles. So these bits right at the front here, these are the actual cerebral peduncles. So all of this area here, this is just made up of axons moving straight through. They are moving downwards into the frontal portion of the pons. And as I say, a great chunk of this will be the corticospinal tract. I think it's the middle portion that's the corticospinal tract. And then around it, you'll have other fibres that are descending that aren't part of the corticospinal tract, and a good majority of those will be part of this corticopontocerebellar pathway. Okay, more important landmarks. I think the next thing to put on is the cerebral aqueduct, which I've told you about previously as well, which is the tube that connects the fourth ventricle inferiorly at the back of the pons to the third ventricle, which sits above the midbrain in between the two thalami. So this little tube here, this is the cerebral aqueduct. And surrounding the cerebral aqueduct is a area of grey matter, which means cell bodies of neurons, called the periaqueductal grey. So I'll put this in here. So this area is the periaqueductal grey matter, another great landmark of the midbrain. And I've just realised that because I've drawn the midbrain in this way, it's not going to look like Mickey Mouse at all. It's going to look like Mickey Mouse upside down. I don't usually draw it in that way. I've drawn it in that way so that it's in the same orientation as the drawing that I drew of the pons. So that structure that we put in is the periaqueductal grey, usually abbreviated down to PAG, but I'll write out its name in full. So, whoops. Again, I've managed to miss out a letter. Periaqua, and I'll have to move a little bit. Periaqueductal, and of course, peri means around, aqueductal means referring to the cerebral aqueduct, and then grey matter because it's made up of grey matter. So PAG for short. So next major landmark of the midbrain. The substantia nigra is probably something that everyone's heard of before, and I was about to say I'm going to draw this in black, but of course I've realised that that's not a good idea. Let's do it in pink. instead. So the reason that the substantia nigra is called the substantia nigra is that actually when you do see it, when you do dissect the brain and you see the substantia nigra, it is black. It has some sort of pigment. I don't know whether that pigment is melanin or whether it's something different, but it has some pigment in it that makes the tissue actually appear black. So this is the substantia, meaning substance, substantia nigra, meaning black, and drawn in pink. Substantia nigra, what other landmarks do we have? Of course, we have the superior colliculi, which are here. Other things that I want to put on is the red nuclei, which are here and here. So, actually no, I've got something to put on before the red nuclei. I've got to put on the medial lemnisci. So the medial lemnisci, these great famous ascending tracts, they come up again through the midbrain. So they go up through the pons and they're going to now come into the midbrain, and they are in this position, just behind the substantia nigra. So there is the left medial lemniscus, and here is the right medial lemniscus. Now let's put on the red nucleus, red nuclei rather, and we'll do these in red. Okay, so here is the red nuclei, and here's another red nuclei. And when you're trying to see this as Mickey Mouse, the red nuclei look like the eyes of Mickey Mouse. So those structures in red are called the red nuclei. So, the final landmark of the midbrain that I want to put on is the mesencephalic reticular formation. Now, I haven't left that much space for the mesencephalic reticular formation. Again, remember that it is a bilaterally symmetric structure that does cross over the midline, so you have one of them. You don't have it on both sides. Well, you do have it on both sides, but you don't have a separate left one and a right one. So it needs to cross the midline, and all of this sort of portion, and unfortunately I've already used the grey, so I'm going to have to come up with some new colour that I can use. I'll use deep blue. So this area here in the mystical, magical blue colour here, all of this is the mesencephalic reticular formation, and you can see it nicely crossing the midline there, and this bit in the middle here will also be reticular formation. So all of that, that's the mesencephalic reticular formation. Right, so those are all the landmarks of the midbrain done, basic anatomy of the midbrain done. Let's now put on the thing that we have come here for, which is the mesencephalic component of the sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. So where is it? It's going to be at the back portion of the reticular formation here. So just in front of the superior colliculi, actually. So these are the superior colliculi, and here is our mesencephalic nucleus of the mesencephalic component of the sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. Now, how can you understand this? Because look, here it was in front of the reticular formation. This reticular formation here is continuous with this. This goes up and becomes this. So how has this suddenly managed to end up like that? We have to remember it's as though this is folded over. When the fourth ventricle goes up to become the cerebral aqueduct, it's as though the whole thing's sort of closing over, folding over to create a cerebral aqueduct in the middle here. So you have to imagine that the reticular formation sort of folded over to create the cerebral aqueduct there, and it sort of dragged this round with it, and you can kind of then understand why the mesencephalic component of the sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve has ended up where it is. Okay, so we have now seen the mesencephalic component of the sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, and we have seen the principal sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. I will have a break here now, and in the next video we will cut through a cross-section of the medulla and see the spinal nucleus and spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve at the level of the medulla, and then we'll go down into the cervical spinal cord and see it there, and then we'll go over how the second-order neurons from these sensory nuclei of the trigeminal nerve are going to actually ascend up to deliver information into the thalami and then up to the primary somatosensory cortex, and then after that we'll go and discuss the primary sensory afferents that are coming in through cervical spinal nerves and how they're going to get up to the primary somatosensory cortex, and then we'll return to the pathophysiology of tension type headaches. So thank you for continuing to watch this video.